welcome all. I'm Andrew Barry, and I'm co-convener of UCL Anthropocene with Sahra Gibbon, who's also on the call. Um, and this is the third of a mini series of conversations about interdisciplinarity we're having at UCL Anthropocene. Um, and I should say, perhaps kind of two backgrounds to this event. One is a book which was published by Georgina Born and myself in 2013, and a project before then on interdisciplinarity, which reflected the what we saw as the reconfigurations of the social and natural sciences occurring in the 2000s. And this is really, at some level, a kind of update, and much has happened since then. Um, and we're exploring a series of kind of crucial interdisciplinary questions today. The other bit of background is a project which Sarah and I and Lucy Sabin and Emily Glaser have been running over the last 2 years or so on chemical exposures, which will lead to a book with UCL Press. And the topic of exposure, chemical exposure, but also other forms of exposure, has become increasingly discussed in anthropology, in feminist and decolonial science and technology studies, and a whole range of other fields, and in the sciences too. So it's this is part of the background of an interest today in the concept which we're going to discuss, the exposome. Um, and perhaps the third background, I should say, is we're very lucky to have and to speak with Professor Nikolas Rose, who is honorary professor at the Institute of Advanced Studies at UCL. And really, for me, this also recalls an extraordinary and vital interdisciplinary conversation which happened many years ago around the work of Michel Foucault, which Nick and others led, and in some ways, this returns to some of those themes of those conversations at that time too. Um, so this will be a conversation. Sarah and I will pose Nick some questions, and we'll explore the question of the exposome and why there should be so much interest in the exposome today, or whether it is something which we need to develop, a concept we need to develop further. First, welcome, Nick.
You.
And perhaps you might say something about why you became interested in this concept. Why should it be of some interest um, to us beyond those who are specialists in this area?
Okay, let me start off, and thanks very much to Andrew and to Sarah for inviting me, and for this conversation. I really hope it can be a bit of a conversation. I'm not going to give a presentation, but just say a little bit about what was interesting to me about this idea of the exposome. But perhaps since Andrew mentioned interdisciplinarity, and it's a kind of seminar about interdisciplinarity. I suppose I have a particular relationship to interdisciplinarity, having started my long and winding career as a biologist at Sussex University, working with a fruit fly geneticist called John Maynard Smith, and ending up in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College. I've kind of wandered through many disciplines and worked with people from many disciplines. But I have to say that the question of interdisciplinarity itself has never really been something that I have kind of focused on. I suppose my approach is very much problem-based, that if you have certain problems and you feel that in order to understand those problems, you've got to work with people from a range of different disciplines, then you work with the people from a range of different disciplines. So rather than posing the question interdisciplinary studies in general, I sort of pose the question of how can one work with the other people that one needs to work with, or the other concepts and explanatory frameworks and styles of thought that one needs to work with in order to explore a certain problem. And it has to be said, and this will be my kind of last word on interdisciplinarity, that many of the things that we now call disciplines started off as interdisciplinary projects. Kind of a while ago, I did some work on the formation of neuroscience. And neuroscience started off, we now talk about neuroscience as if there was a discipline of neuroscience, but neuroscience started off as an explicitly interdisciplinary project that bring together all the people from a whole range of different disciplines who were kind of working on the brain, and then find a name for it. And the name was neuroscience. So what we have as disciplines kind of started off as non-disciplines. Anyhow, talking of neuro, I guess my interest in the exposome really started from the work that I was doing on mental distress in conditions of adversity. I've always worked a bit on psychiatry, and I was working with my partner, Professor Diana Rose, on kind of practical alternatives to biomedical psychiatry. And in the course of thinking about practical alternatives to biomedical psychiatry, of course, the conventional way is to oppose biomedical explanations of mental distress with, quote, environmental explanations of mental distress. But then, you raise the thorny issue of what on earth it is that you mean by the environment. And for those who know anything about the history of these debates, one of the alternative kind of organizing frameworks or terms is the idea of biopsychosocial, the biopsychosocial model of mental distress. But the biopsychosocial model of mental distress sort of points in a hand-waving way to a whole bunch of things that might possibly be and might possibly not be involved in the mental distress of any particular individual. It doesn't really help you identify what in any particular case might be important, how it might be important, let alone how, through what kinds of pathways, mechanistic pathways, as they tend to be called these days, through what kind of pathways these things get under the skin and shape the body and the soul of the person who is the subject, the subjectivity of the person who is mentally distressed. And quite rightly, when I've had this discussion with other disciplines, notably with neuroscientists at many conferences, they immediately come back and say, that's a bunch of hand-waving guff that you social scientists always come up with. So how can one make the idea of the environment somehow more specific? What's meant by an environment? Of course, we know that epidemiology breaks down environments into a bunch of factors. There is poverty, there is racism, there is overcrowding, there is immigration, etc., etc., etc. And these factors are related correlationally to the incidence or prevalence of different kinds of mental distress. But correlational thought doesn't really get one very far, in my view. And when I was working with my former colleague Des Fitzgerald on urban mental health, we found correlational thought which linked the urban to mental distress extremely unhelpful. So how can one be a little bit more precise? My way of being a little bit more precise was to try and develop a different way of thinking about mental distress, which I called in a paper which has finally just been published, 5E approaches to mental distress. And it took its starting point really from 3E or 4E cognition, the idea that that cognitive processes are not embrained, but they are extended and emplaced, that we think through and with our engagement with those things that surround us. Many of you will know the work of Andy Clark and the whole work of cognitive science that kind of took off from that approach. Cognition in this approach is extended beyond the bodies and brains of the individual. It's emplaced in a particular place and space, and it's enacted through actions in that place and space. So if that's the case for cognition, perhaps that's the case for mental processes as a whole, and perhaps that's the case for mind, and perhaps that's the case for mental distress. It's embodied, it's inbrained, it's extended, and it's emplaced. And then working with my colleagues, Nick Manning and Rasmus Birk when I was at KCL, we wrote a little paper which drew on these ideas and formatted these in terms of what we called rather uglily a neuro-eco-social niche, that in order to understand forms of mental distress in adversity, you had to begin to characterize the eco-neurosocial niche in which people made their lives, that their mental distress was, in a sense, distributed across that niche. It's embodied, it's emplaced, it's extended. So how can one think about that neuro-eco-social niche? And it was through trying to think about that niche that I came across the idea of the exposome, and the idea that perhaps one could think about that niche as a kind of a concatenation of exposures that a person experiences across their lifetime. And it was through thinking about pathogenic eco-social niches that I came to the work of Chris Wilde and his classic paper of 2005, which first formulated the idea of the exposome. And if Emma is still around, she can put up the classic picture that Chris Wilde developed of his idea of the exposome. That's the end of my introductory remarks as to how I got interested in the exposome. Right, this is Chris Wilde's picture of the exposome. And I'll just say this very, very quickly and then get on to the discussion. So he actually published a paper in 2005. He's written a rather nice thing about the history of this paper. Chris Wilde was a cancer researcher, in particular working on liver cancer, and he was convinced by the epidemiology of liver cancer and his studies on liver cancer that less than 20% of the burden, the incidence of liver cancer, could be attributed to genetics, and the vast majority of the incidence of liver cancer had to do with environmental dimensions, in particular with what he was looking at, which were aflatoxins, which were found in staple foods in many areas of Africa. And these aflatoxins were when they were ingested, were strongly related to the development of liver cancer. And he was writing this at the high point of genomics, just at the beginning of this century. And he said, look, we give all this emphasis to genomics, but genomics really can't help us understand the burden of chronic diseases. In order to understand the burden of chronic diseases, we've got to think about the environment and environmental impact in the same way as we've thought about genomic impact. And perhaps we can use some of the same ways of thinking and some of the same ways of calculating and some of the same ways of analyzing big data, et cetera, and let's call that the exposome. And for the next 5 years, there were no references whatsoever to this paper that he wrote in 2005, until in 2010, it was picked up by a couple of other exposure scientists and led to an article in the New Scientist called Welcome to the Exposome, which was very critical of the idea that you could use genomics to calculate the burden of chronic disorders, and said instead that you had to recognize that risk for chronic disorders was fundamentally related to the exposures that individuals were subject to across their life course, and we ought to start devoting the same amount of time, energy, and research to these exposures as we have been to genomics, because genomics is never going to enable us to understand the risk and the burden of chronic disorders. So that's, I think, probably where I've said enough in my introduction.
Can I just come in there, Nico? So what's interesting about this story, I mean, he had terrible problems in publishing. He'd actually almost sort of semi-self-published as the paper.
Yeah.
And it takes a long time to be picked up. What is intriguing is that it's not directly kind of well, it's kind of it's approaching your problem from the other side, the other direction, if you like. But it's actually it's entering into this space between genomics, epidemiology, and toxicology, and in itself, it's in that kind of it's moving into making connections between those fields as well.
Yeah, I mean, as you said right at the beginning, Andrew, the key term in all this is the idea of exposure. And you will know much more than me about how exposures work in toxicology, the emergence of exposure science, uh, and the idea that you had to move away from general accounts of toxins and how toxic they were to the place and places at which an individual comes into touch with a certain level, a certain dose of an exposure. And this idea of the contact between an individual and a dose of exposure uh, is kind of central to exposure science and central to the idea of the exposome. And so one might begin to wonder, because as people can see from the diagram, Wilde has these three sort of domains of the exposome: the internal exposome, like the metabolism, hormones, gut microflora, very, very popular these days to explain things in terms of gut microflora, etc. Then there are the specific external ones, which I guess, and Andrew would know miles more about this than me, which I guess are the chemical exposures, where you can, in a sense, you can calibrate the amount of chemical in an environment in general, or the amount of particular chemical in a river, or the amount of chemical in a toxin in a diet, or the amount, as in Michelle Murphy's kind of work, in a sick building, the amount of chemical in a sick building. You can use all sorts of biosensors in order to identify them. You can see how they enter into the body, what kind of pathways they enter into the body. So that's a kind of idea of exposure. But can you, in all those things that he's put in the top bubble there, general, external, can you put social capital, education, financial status, psychological and mental stress, urban, rural environment, climate, etc.? And the etc. is doing quite a bit of work there, I guess. Can you put all those in this? Can you think those in the same way?
So do you see
I
yourself
guess that's the question which maybe is worth posing in the course of our discussion. Is it sensible to think about those things as exposures in the same way?
Mm. Before we go on to that, I mean, can you say anything more about why you think it took so long for it to take off, um, to have any traction, um, given the kind of given the he posed the problem, but and there's a lot of data that can be brought to bear on it. Why did it take so long to take off?
It's kind of not clear to me, except if you think that this was the high point of genomics. It was when genomics was seeking to become practical. It was when the idea of genomic risk, genetic risk, sequencing the genome, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the idea of genomic interventions and so on, had kind of wiped out the idea of the environment in many ways. And I don't know, because Christopher Wilde, I mean, later he became a very prominent director of Institute for Cancer Research and so on and so forth. He was not, and he was an editor of a journal, as you say, Andrew. He published it in his own journal in the end. He published it in a special issue of a journal in his own in the end. So why it was, I guess, you could turn this into a kind of STS kind of question. A Ludwig Fleck kind of question. There was a prevailing style of thought that took shape at the end of the 20th and beginning of the 20th century, within which only problems posed in a certain way could become intelligible. Um, and the exposome did not pose those problems in that way. In a sense, by saying, as they said in 2010, when the paper got a lot of publicity, etc., from then on, the people who were talking about it in those days, in that time, explicitly tried to use the language of genomics, metabolomics, et cetera, in order to reframe the exposome in a sort of as a kind of parallel dimension to the genome. But when they said, only 10% of the global burden of chronic diseases can be explained by genomics, they're saying something which, in a sense, was almost unsayable at the time of the high point of genomics, and certainly unfundable in the sense that you wouldn't get a stonking great grant like the Human Genome Project got to look at that at that point. Although, of course, as we know now, there are exposomics, big exposome consortia funded by European funding, funded by pre-Trump US NIH funding. So now the exposome is kind of big business. And that's partly because of also, and this is another part of the story, partly because people say, well, the exposome is tremendously complicated. I mean, just look at all those things. But now we can collect data and we have AI to analyze it. So that's the way in which the field is moving.
I'm going to hand over to Sahra actually in a minute, but just it occurs to me, thinking of that kind of that cluster of kind of heterogeneous kinds of factors which enter into the exposome. It's actually simultaneous with the kind of the growth of the kind of view of climate change being a kind of product of this kind of whole cluster of, or even the Anthropocene as kind of this cluster of different things which transform the system. Just whether there's a kind of family relation. Anyway, that's moving beyond the topic of the exposome. Perhaps Sahra, do you want to come in with a question?
Yeah, sure. No, I think it's super fascinating thinking, just to reflect a little bit on this, the post-genomic kind of space really, and what does get taken up and what doesn't. And so epigenetics, kind of becomes sort of a much more actionable kind of area, but the exposome not. And, it is interesting to reflect on that. Why? But I wanted to draw it into a different direction slightly and think about in a sense, the sort of almost parallel and not much in dialogue kind of increase in eventually discussion around the exposome, and now increasingly in the science and of exposome science, and also this question of the growth of interest and exposure in social science as well. And there's not always kind of much dialogue between them. So, we think about Aya Wahlberg's, kind of exposed biologies, Hannah Landeker's focus on food as exposures, and we're very much thinking about sort of the impact of industrial histories of food production and pollution, etc. But I think it's interesting to reflect on why there has been this sort of increase in interest in exposure in social science and then the exposome, but not necessarily much kind of integration or critical reflection even across those fields. I just wondered, whether Nick, you had any thoughts about why that might be. Is it about an inherent sort of distrust, kind of post-genomics, of any sort of attempt to frame things in this sort of somewhat totalizing kind of a way? I guess what the possibilities or the dangers might be in having a more productive dialogue around sort of the interest and exposure in social science in these different areas, and this kind of this science interest in the exposome within different fields of research.
So I think you're absolutely right about it. And one thing which is probably just worth picking up on is epigenetics. Because I suppose if you wanted to say how genomics could interface with the idea of the exposome, it is because of the increasing interest in the modifications of the genome as a result of exposures across the life course. So in that sense, you can make exposomics compatible with genomics via the pathway of epigenetics or epigenomics. And especially now you can use high throughput genome sequencing to sequence the epigenome. Somehow the things have moved into the same style of thought, or they don't work as if they are in opposition to one another anymore. but on the issue of exposures, I mean, I was just reading a month or so ago the handbook of DOHAD, of the Developmental Origins of Health and Disease, which was put together by Michel Pentecost and a couple of other people. And I just did a rough search of the number of mentions of the word exposure in that, or exposed in that, Developmental Origins of Health and Disease, and it runs into hundreds, if not thousands, of uses of the word exposure and exposed. So certainly in that domain, in the domain of trying to argue about how adversity across the life course can shape an individual's health status, the idea of exposure and epigenetics is a very, very powerful one. And Hannah Landecker, of course, as well as writing that paper on food as exposure, also wrote about environmental epigenetics, which is all about exposures. I suppose the challenge for me is whether or not it's possible to think about social capital, education, financial status, etc., as exposures. Because if you look, and this is more Andrew's domain than mine, if you look at some of the work on chemical exposures, it is all about using biosensors to collect vast amounts of information and biomarkers to collect vast amounts of information on individuals' exposures across their life course. And the exposures are, in a sense, they are specifiable, they are precise, they are measurable, they are calculable, they can be added up to an exposure index. I think there are these exposure indices which are kind of function a little like adverse calculations of adverse childhood experience. How many ACEs have you got? What's your exposure index, and so on. I'm not clear. Oh, that's gone. I'm not clear that is actually a viable way forward. And in my little essay, which is now published, I'm glad to say, after 2 years in transcultural psychiatry, I kind of suggest a different way of thinking about exposures, but and a way of placing that in a more general context. Sorry, that's a bit of a ramble. I'm not quite sure that's a...
No, that's fine. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's the question of, kind of measuring and, kind of that kind of calculation, the score of exposures, and I guess there's a sort of inherent sort of distrust of that process, when we think about what the social is from a social science perspective. And I think it comes back to some of these questions of, what is an exposure, and kind of how can we get beyond a sense of a sort of passive kind of individual exposures, whereas in fact many exposures are very experientially kind of located, and how can we kind of implot experiences into the exposome and the kind of dynamic reactive agentive kind of relationship that we have with exposures, different kind of social exposures, whether we're thinking about contexts of adversity or experiences of racism, or even kind of pollution, in fact, as well. I think one of the challenges here is how we kind of reframe what exposure is, maybe in a much more contextualize, as you're saying, kind of the 5 E's, the implotted, implaced kind of way, and the challenge of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right in pointing to the kind of relation, or the paradoxical relation, between an exposure and experience. So is racism an exposure, or is racism an experience? Is fear of violence an exposure to being in a place where there are lots of police reports of violence, or is it an experience which an individual has, which may be related to their memories, to dread, to stories, to metaphors, to a whole series of other kinds of things, but not to an exposure as a brute fact. And if you kind of explore a little bit how this is working out in when people talk about the social exposome, and I've been looking a little bit at some of this stuff more recently, the pathway, because where I started off was saying, well, if you talk about biopsychosocial models, what was the pathway by which these things get under the skin? The pathway almost always in exposomic kind of address to things like racism is stress, is psychological and mental stress, as it's in the bubble here, there. So, and stress, of course, is a highly contested and problematic concept, but nonetheless, it does provide a kind of mechanistic way in which experiences can get under the skin. So it seems to provide an exposure, experience, internalization kind of pathway. Whether it's a satisfactory one, I don't know. Whether you can bundle all these things together into the one bag of stress seems to me a little bit reductionist, you know?
Yeah.
And of course, just, you know, I think we'd probably move to have some questions, but I mean, the other thing worth saying in relation to my initial question about mental distress in adversity is that if you look at adversity, some of the work that we're doing with my colleagues in São Paulo, in the favelas in São Paulo, some of the forms of adversity are those specific external factors that Wilde references in his diagram here. Their presence of chemical agents, their presence of pollutions, their presence of polluted water, polluted food, excessive use of alcohol, excessive use of tobacco, working in highly polluted environments, etc., etc., etc. So, you know, one wants to keep in touch with those very specific exposures to the chemosphere, as I believe it's now being called, as well as to the other ones, in thinking about my original question, which is about mental distress.
I mean, yeah, if we want to look at this diagram in a much more kind of relational dynamic way, I think we'd see how specific external exposures are totally shaped by all the other factors in the general external context as well. So this diagram doesn't quite represent, I think, the dynamism that you're talking to, Nick. Yeah. I don't know, Andrew, did you want to pick up anything, or should we open
we
to
could move to more general questions. I mean, I'm tempted to ask the question maybe of whether, to what extent is that, or rather looking at the question the other way around, to what extent people themselves are regarding themselves as exposed and therefore having to create various kinds of barriers, protections, and maneuvers around the problem of exposure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And one of the things about the exposome literature is the idea, even for the chemical exposures, that human beings are kind of passive recipients of these kinds of things, when of course we know that they're not. Even if you're talking about people harvesting crops that have toxins in them, people are aware that the crops have toxins in them, or people having to use contaminated water supplies, or people walking through dangerous environments. That's why in my rather forlorn 5Es approach, the idea of inaction, that human beings are always active in relation to these things. They're not passive recipients. They're acting and shaping a way through their niche, I think is absolutely crucial. And, you know, certainly in history, for some reason, which I won't bore everyone with, I was looking at the history of excrement and sanitation. People's views about the pollutions in excrement and the strengths and weaknesses of different sanitation practices have radically shaped the ways in which they interact with this particular body of pollutants. And I think the same is true in all sorts of other ways.
Perhaps this is a good moment to ask those who are online if you could to post any questions or to Nick via the chat. Emma, could you take down the slide sharing and we'll just move to the screen. Or if you prefer to, you're very welcome to put your hand up and ask the question directly. We'll stop. We won't record we won't keep the recording from now on. So feel free to make any intervention you want.